this is the Medical College of Wisconsin's Oral History Project, and I'm Dick Katchke, the Chief Historian. Today is September 14th, 2016, and I'm talking with Dr. Ann Nattinger, who is the Lady Writers Professor for Breast Cancer Research, Professor in General Internal Medicine, the Director of the Center for Patient Care Outcomes Research, and recently is the new Senior Associate Dean for Research at MCW.
Right.
Have I left out any titles?
No, thankfully you've
Okay.
hit most.
You're wearing a lot
The
of hats.
important ones, right?
Well, Dr. Nattinger, let's start with what led to your interest in medicine? When did you first realize that, I want to go to medical school?
Yeah. So I think it was when I was in high school. My mother had been a nurse. I did well in science. I enjoyed the idea of taking care of people, helping people, make people better. I thought about becoming a nurse, and but at about that time, when I was kind of halfway through high school, I had a close friend whose mother developed breast cancer, and in fact died of it relatively quickly within a year or two. And as that was happening, I thought to myself, boy, I wonder if I could be the doctor. And my parents were fairly traditional, but were always supportive, and they supported me in that idea, even though there had been no physicians in our family, much less a female physician.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And you wound up at medical school at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Why there?
So by the time I went to medical school, I was married, and unless my husband was going to relocate, I needed to think seriously about Chicago. Actually, he would have relocated for me, but as it turned out, I was able to get into a couple of the Chicago medical schools. And to be honest, I chose University of Illinois because, well, I knew of it. I had done my bachelor's work at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I knew it's an outstanding institution, and it was cheaper. And I was worried about how much debt we would run up, and so decided to go there.
Very good.
Yeah.
And at what point did you make the decision that internal medicine was the field that you wanted to go into for a specialty?
Yeah, so very good question. I have to say, by the time I was through with my second year of medical school, I did not have a clue what I would do. I was thinking, as I was exposed to each field, practically every field, I loved it. And in each of my third year clerkships, I liked each field, but I did internal medicine relatively late in the game. And when I thought about it carefully, I thought that I was probably best aligned kind of temperamentally and intellectually with the internists that I ran into. I actually had a wonderful mentor when I did my surgery clerkship, who was Olga Jonassen, who became the first woman chair of surgery of a surgery department in the US. She became the chair of surgery at Ohio State after she left Cook County Hospital, which is where she and I crossed paths. And she tried to talk me into surgery, which was very flattering for me. But I realized that my heart laid more in the idea of diagnostic dilemmas and longer-term relationships, and the idea of spending a lot of time doing surgeries, relatively shorter periods of time, usually to interact with patients, and a lot more emphasis on procedures. I could have loved it. I'm sure I could have, but I thought I was better aligned with the field of medicine, and I've never regretted that.
At what point was it that you also made the decision that you were interested in the field of research?
I did not make that decision until I was in residency. Although I explored research while I was in medical school, I think during my third and fourth years of medical school, maybe even in my second year, I had research experiences. I did some work in an immunology lab and killed mice and studied their antibodies that they made to tumors, and I enjoyed that work. But when I got into my residency, I was exposed to a different type of research. I was exposed to faculty in the School of Public Health. And I realized that that type of research resonated with me even more than did research in the natural sciences.
And your residency was at the University of Rochester, if I'm correct, and you were at Strong Memorial then, correct?
Right, that's right. So I was at the University of Rochester in a program which sadly no longer exists. It was the primary care program for internal medicine. They no longer have that program, but at the time I was there, it was a vibrant and large program that for which we rotated not only at Strong Memorial, but also at Rochester General and at a couple of the other community hospitals. So that was nice because I was very comfortable in the university hospital, Strong Memorial Hospital, but I was also very used to what real life was like out in the community hospitals. So it was a good experience for me.
And while you were in Rochester, you then went for your master's in public health then, correct?
Right. So what the decision making actually was that I decided during my residency program that I would like to stay in academic medicine, but I was so interested in the general field of general internal medicine, not wanting to go into a subspecialty at that point, but I got good advice from some of my mentors at that time who said, if you're going to make it in an academic setting, even if you want to be a generalist for your clinical work, you're going to need to figure out how to have, how to make contributions to research and how to be a good teacher. So they convinced me that I should do a fellowship in general internal medicine. Actually, those fellowships were very new at that time. We're talking the late 1980s. And
at that point, usually a fellowship meant going into cardiology or into hematology, something like that, correct?
right. A fellowship was typically at that time only done to gain new clinical skills. Although typically when internal medicine graduates went into cardiology or pulmonary, they would often have some kind of a research experience. But the idea of doing a fellowship more for the research and education skills and not so much to learn new clinical skills, that was a new idea. And it didn't have the best return on investment if you were to look at it financially. But what it did was prepare me for a field that I've loved. And so the return on investment probably wasn't financially there, but it was there with regard to me being happy, with regard to a happiness investment, with regard to me being satisfied, with me being able to function as a general internist and help build a field nationally of general internal medicine. That was the return on investment for me.
In public health, was there an area that you were focused on in terms of any of the research that you conducted as you were going for your degree?
So, well, I had a broad background in public health, especially in systems of care and in community health. So those were the two areas. How do you put together systems that work for accomplishing health care, and then community health. So those were my two areas of emphasis. My thesis, I had to write a thesis for the public health degree there. The thesis was on a randomized trial of usual care versus two different interventions to improve the use of screening mammography. And to be honest, I think it came from that friend of mine whose mother developed breast cancer when I was in high school. I had an interest in breast cancer and what could we do to reduce the burden of that disease. And so I was very interested in promoting the use of mammography, which was a relatively new screening tool at that time. Everyone was not getting mammograms at that time. And there was a lot of work to be done to convince the doctors how to order mammograms more effectively. They would forget. And how to convince the patients not to be afraid of mammograms and that they were a good idea. So it turned out that the research studies that supported the use of screening mammography had come out in the early 80s and the late 80s. During the late 80s, it was a good time to recognize that the research was not being translated into actual care very effectively. And that was the theme of a lot of my early work, the idea that research comes out, research is done on selected populations, and it does not always get translated very quickly into broader community-based care.
Isn't that still a challenge today?
It is. It is still a challenge, the idea of the translation of what we know in theory to getting it used in practice, and not just getting it used, but getting it used effectively across different populations. It's still a challenge. And even though my work has continued with that same general theme, I have moved over the years into different areas like disparities in care and addressing underserved populations, but it's always that same idea. What we know is effective is not necessarily what happens in clinical practice. Sometimes due to physician reasons, sometimes due to patient concerns or fears or barriers or finances or so many things that we study in the Masters of Public Health program. But uncovering those barriers, which are not the same for one issue as they are for another issue. So it's not like you can just say, well, here's the answer for everything.
Now, after you finished your graduate work in public health and finished your residency and your fellowship, you then entered the career of academic medicine, and you came to MCW first. What led you to Milwaukee, and who did you interview with? What were your impressions when you first came here in 1988?
Yeah, so I was interested in being in the Chicago area if I could be, and I had gotten an interview at Northwestern. But I had a colleague in Rochester who knew Jim Bird here, who was head of the GIM division at the VA. And Jim Bird referred me to Mark Young, who was then very early in his tenure as division chief of general internal medicine. And it was under the chairman, Dan McCarty. The other person who had helped to bring in Mark Young was Jim Goodwin, who subsequently became a research mentor of mine. So when I first came here to interview, I interviewed with Jim, went over to the VA, I met Mark Young and his wife, who was also a physician, a pediatrician. I met Jim Goodwin, who was very interested in the research I had done. He was himself, although trained as an immunologist, he had done some epidemiologically oriented work as well. So he could see the value of health services research. They brought me in to be the first faculty member to try to develop an NIH-funded research program, which neither of them particularly had. They had done important research, but not funded by NIH.
When you came, were you based at the VA or were you based at the Milwaukee County Hospital?
Yeah, so I remember discussing this with Mark Young, we weren't sure what would be the best for me. The VA thought that they wanted to start a women's health clinic, and I was attractive to them for that. But he wasn't sure if that would get off the ground or if it was more hopefulness. So my first year I was split almost equally, half and half, between the VA and the Milwaukee County Hospital. And then at the end of that first year, I had secured a grant in, or was about to secure one in the area of breast cancer. And the VA's hopes for women's health clinic, although they have a wonderful women's health clinic now, it didn't appear that it was on the immediate horizon. So by my second year, Mark Young had moved me to the county hospital campus. Mm-hmm. At that time, I mean, Freighter was a small entity. I got my first NIH grants so I started in 1988, and by 1991, I think I had my first NIH grant. But I didn't feel established until the middle to the end of the decade.
But that said, the fact that in 1991 you were awarded an NIH grant when you were really only 3 years out of your residency
Right.
training and fellowship training,
Right.
that's pretty remarkable.
It was remarkable as I look back on it, because at that time, what was truly missing for the field of general internal medicine was the idea of a career development award. Now we have K awards. Now if I have a young general internist who wants to go into research, I will try to get them into a K award of some type, either an NIH K award or there are similar career development awards that they might get from other places. But at that time, no one was going to give a K award to a generalist. Yes, to a cardiologist or to an oncologist. But there weren't that many K awards, and they certainly weren't going the direction of a generalist.
And what was your first award for?
My first award was a tiny little RO1. I don't know if the RO3 mechanism even existed, but now it would be an RO3. It was a $50,000 award to use Medicare data, which the Biostatistics and Epidemiology group had acquired. They had acquired inpatient Medicare data. And Jim Goodwin and I worked together on what could we do with that Medicare data. So I was interested in screening mammography, but the data that we had was only inpatient data. Well, as it turned out, I was also interested in why were my patients getting mastectomies when a big study had come out showing the equivalence of breast-conserving surgery or lumpectomy for treatment of breast cancer as opposed to mastectomy. And at that time, almost all breast cancer surgeries were conducted as inpatient procedures. Even now, many of them are inpatient procedures, at least for a night or two, at least for pain control, if for no other reason.
Sure.
But so we came up with the idea of studying whether breast-conserving surgery was being adopted into community practice by using the Medicare data. So again, it was the same idea of what I had done when I was doing a study to try to promote the adoption of mammography. But in this case, we were able to demonstrate what were the predictors of the early adoption of a new breast cancer procedure, the procedure of lumpectomy. I saw it as some people create a mouse model to do their studies. We were using breast cancer as a model for how was a new treatment being adopted into clinical practice. Mm-hmm. How is it moving from the clinical trial environment, phase 3 clinical trial environment, into more general use. And because we had Medicare data for the whole country, we actually had all the inpatient medical records at that time for the entire country. Jim Goodwin helped me think of good questions to ask using that data. And I switched from the area of looking at mammography as a subject to evaluating the use of lumpectomy and who was getting it. And one of the first things we did, since we had the whole country, we looked at geographic variation. And we looked at it by state, and we saw dramatic differences. We were looking at the use of lumpectomy in the first year after the publication of the large US randomized trial that said that lumpectomy was just as good as mastectomy for 5-year survival, which eventually was 10-year survival and eventually was 20-year survival. Yes. So we used Medicare data for the following year. Everyone knew about that trial. It was published in the New England Journal. So we used Medicare data for, I think it was 1986 data, but I was doing the work later than that, of course, after Medicare had, you know, gotten the data assembled and cleaned and so forth. And the first thing that we did was look at the geographic variation. And even if you aggregated by state level, which is quite a few patients in each state, there was massive geographic variation, but it also clustered. So the northeastern part of the US was using more lumpectomy. They were rapid adopters. Florida, kind of a rapid adopter. West Coast, kind of a rapid adopter. And the southern and Great Plains and Midwestern states, very slow adopters. So here I was in Wisconsin, which was one of the slower states. You know, and I think it's partly an issue of medical conservatism, not to want to adopt a new treatment, not to necessarily be the first one on the block with it.
There was a skepticism.
Yeah. And in the areas of the country, especially both coasts, they seem to be more willing to adopt this new treatment more quickly.
Well, and didn't you find too that there was earlier adapters in urban areas compared to rural? And did it matter if it was an area that had a heavy concentration of academic medical centers? Were they more likely than?
Yeah, so good questions. And one of the things that the Medicare data allowed us to do was, again, to look at urban versus rural, because in the past there just hadn't been much data at all on rural hospitals. But if you had Medicare, you had everyone. You only had a limited age group, but you had pretty much the whole country for your age group. So we showed that women treated in more urban hospitals were more than twice as likely to get a lumpectomy. We showed that we linked the hospital claims to the American Hospital Association database that allowed us to know which hospitals were teaching hospitals. And we did find that the teaching hospitals were more rapid adopters. And we also found that larger hospitals, so it was larger hospitals, teaching hospitals, urban hospitals, and then Northeast and West Coast, those were the hospitals that were adopting the treatment of breast-conserving surgery the most rapidly. And other hospitals were, you know, maybe several times slower. So it might have been 24% use in certain northeastern hospitals, 25% use, when it might have been 3% use in Kentucky, for example, in hospitals in Kentucky.
But your study was one of the first that was actually doing some population health studies at MCW,
right,
if I recall.
Now we might call ourselves population health management studies. But at that time, we saw it as looking at it, we saw it as the translation of new research findings from the ivory tower and the places where the trials were being done to the community base. So you could see it either way, and over time it certainly developed. But until that time, almost all medical research was done predominantly in university settings.
Yes.
But as has been shown by Larry Green and others, only about 10%, even now, only about 10% of healthcare happens in a university hospital setting. But disproportionately, the university hospitals are the places where new treatments get tried out. And so that can give their patients the edge of having access to treatments quite a bit before they make their way out to other types of hospitals. Although in recent years, as there's been more merging of hospitals and academic health systems have merged with community hospitals, as we have done in our academic health center, I think there has been a move to bring more of the new treatments and make them more available to patients who are treated in the community hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there's been a push from NIH to do that as well. Mm-hmm. You know, not to just keep the new treatments for the university hospitals, but to make sure that treatments diffuse out into the community and rural populations much more quickly.
Now, you then also were in internal medicine. You rose and you were named the chief of internal medicine then as well.
Of general internal medicine. Right.
And so, how did you, as you assumed that new role, you were now also mentoring, the faculty members in general internal medicine.
Right.
How did you perceive your role, and what is it that you felt are the challenges that you wanted to address?
Yeah. So it was, general internal medicine was still a field that was considered fairly young by academic standards. Many departments of medicine nationally, when I became chief of GIM here, they still did not even have a division of general internal medicine. So when I say GIM, I mean general internal medicine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it was still a field that was looking to secure academic credibility. And part of the reason the field had not secured more academic credibility was the fact that it was still hard to get research funding in that area. Mm-hmm. So I think I was selected, and one of my big contributions was to increase the number of faculty in the division that had research funding, mm-hmm. that were doing research actively and that had active research funding. But the other thing that I would say was not so much a charge from the department chair or the dean, but a charge that I gave myself, was to make sure that the clinician educator faculty had the opportunity to participate in the academic scholarly mission as well. So I insisted on protecting some time, maybe less time for those individuals, but some of their time so that they could also do research, but their research wasn't like the research that I was doing. It wasn't NIH-funded research by and large, but it was often the area that we chose as our research area for our clinician educators was to do research on how to teach more effectively. And that was research that could be done on more of a shoestring budget, that was of great interest to the educators, and that actually allowed us to develop collaborations initially with the other generalist disciplines here at MCW. So for example, when we started wanting to do research in that area, I made contact with Deb Simpson, who was a PhD in education. He was also was appointed to family medicine, so also a generalist discipline, but she had the PhD background in education that I did not have. And she helped me to mentor our young clinician educators, the one who had an interest in being more academically focused, and the ones who wanted to develop themselves so that they would be competitive to lead clerkships and to maybe move up in the academic arena of academic affairs. Deb Simpson helped me. I worked with Deb Simpson to put grants into the HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, a part of the government that recognized that they could do something to help build a better workforce in medicine. And so they were receptive to having grants in the area of faculty development. And we got one of the earliest grants in the area of faculty development. The principal investigator of it now is Dr. Linda Moyer. She's done a great job with it, but it's got a long history dating back to a time when medical education was just not a very visible or highly thought of area.
Now, one of the other things you helped create was the Center for Patient Care Outcomes Research.
Yes.
What led to that?
So I had become a funded investigator at that point, but honestly, I think there might have, if there were more than one or two other people who had funding in health services research or in patient effectiveness research, as we called it at that time, I would be surprised. I cannot think of very many, if any, other individuals who actually had federal funding in that area. And but Mike Dunn, who was dean at that time, he had heard about the field, I think at the AAMC, and he called me into his office. It was the first time probably that I personally met a dean. And he called me into his office to ask me about this field, and I described for him what I was doing and what I saw the field being nationally, where it was going, and the area of what I might call now health services research, or that we might even call population health management, but health services research is probably a better title for it. And so he asked me to put together a task force to try to think about what MCW could do in this area. And he called it the Medical Effectiveness Research Committee, I guess, because I think it was MERC. Merck.
I remember that, yes. Yes.
And I chaired the task force, and he got someone from Freighter to be on it, or from, actually I don't know if anyone from Freighter was on it, but someone from County Hospital was on it, maybe Freighter as well. And then, yeah, I guess it would have been Freighter. And then he knew of some others who were interested in this area and helped me to populate this, this committee. And we did a study of the area. We looked at what other institutions were doing. We learned of some models, mostly through my contacts, but also some of the other contacts of other individuals on that committee. And we put together a white paper that we submitted to Dean Dunn. And he liked the idea. And what we recommended was that MCW develop a center that could allow us to recruit some faculty, which would be housed in various departments, predominantly clinical departments, of course, but that having the center would give them an academic home and allow them to have like-minded individuals without growing the field through just one department or two departments. And so the idea was that we would try to get to interest several departments into having individuals who would be interested in what we called patient care and outcomes research, meaning patient care research and outcomes research. And but that it wouldn't be a departmental center, it would be a college-wide center, allowing participation by a broader group of faculty.
What were some of the things that you're proudest of in terms of some of the findings that you did come to, did find?
So I'm proud of a number of areas. I'm proud that we took the field that started out as defining patterns of practice, like my first New England Journal article, the one that looked at lumpectomy across the country. That was defining a practice pattern. That was important. I mean, it's kind of an outcome which surgery you have, but we moved to other outcomes that were maybe even more relevant to patients, like, did you live for 5 years or 10 years? What was your quality of life like? So people are interested in having longer survival, but they're interested in having longer meaningful survival. They want to have quality of life and survival. And so we help to define the movement from patterns of care to how those patterns of care led to better outcomes and outcomes that were important to patients. And I'm really proud of that movement. Then we got into public policy. We helped to define what public policy maneuvers worked or did not work to improve the health of U.S. women. My second New England Journal article was actually studying some laws that have been passed, trying to, again, we often used breast cancer as our model disease for studying policies or other things. But so in the second New England Journal article, we studied when states were passing laws saying that doctors had to give patients their full options for breast cancer care, which was coming about because we had shown that in some states they were not getting an option of lumpectomy, probably. Why else would the rate of use have been 3%? So some states were reacting to those data by passing laws saying doctors have to give patients all their outcomes. We showed that those laws had only a very short-lived effect. They had a very transient effect, probably due to the publicity surrounding the law, not the law itself. Yeah. And, so we said, state laws are not the way to go. You cannot legislate the doctor-patient relationship. You have to go other ways. You have to work through professional societies. You have to work through the field to really make durable advances that would help patients. And I think that that idea is still an important idea, that when people outside of field try to change the field through outside forces like laws, they have to be really careful about it. Some public policies can work better than others. And in healthcare, where public policies work well is via insurance coverage, and CMS has used public policies effectively, through what they will cover and through making rules. If you're going to take Medicare funding, you have to do X or Y. But that's still using an insurance program as a lever for public policy. That works well. And I think we were among the groups that showed one type of public policies will work well, the other type won't work well. Then, if you'll give me a chance to tell you one more thing I'm proud of. I think our group was one of the first to really start looking at disparities in care in a real way. And I remember studying, we estimated whether patients were low socioeconomic status or of more affluent, higher socioeconomic status based on where they lived. Not perfect. It's not perfect, but your zip code is
Zip codes are an indicator.
fairly
Yeah.
predictive of whether you're a poorer, less educated
Yeah.
patient or whether you're a more affluent, usually then greater chance of being better educated patient. And we showed, again, using breast conserving surgery as our first model, but now we've done it with many other things. We showed that the patients residing in the more affluent zip codes were getting better care. They were getting better care, and now, more recently, we have extended it to better survival. So I could show you a graph that women with breast cancer who live in a more affluent zip code, based on census data, I don't have to know the woman's own income,
Yeah.
that she's got twice the chance of being alive 5 years after she develops her breast cancer than does a woman living in a very poor zip code or who has Medicaid for her insurance, which Medicaid is an indicator normally of very few financial resources. One thing that I have not done as much in my career that I am looking for people who come after me to do is to extend the kind of, we've looked at the national picture. We've tended to use national databases, national surveys. We've conducted national surveys. We've done a lot of work to demonstrate important new principles in our field, including the principles of socioeconomic status disparities. But what we haven't done so much of my work has not been, and it won't be my legacy, it'll be the legacy of the people I'm training now, that I'm mentoring now, is translating that into our local catchment area. And at the time that I started, I wouldn't have gotten funding to just do a study based in Milwaukee. Now, it's possible to get that kind of funding, and that's where our cancer center is going, right? That's one of the rationales that our cancer center has for why it should exist, why we should get funding from the National Cancer Institute, because we have the underserved communities in our backyard. And even though there's another designated cancer center in the state, we have the patients who need this kind of work. So what I'm concentrating on now is not so much my own research. I've matured to a point where I've gotten a lot of grants, and I will still keep doing, I suppose I'll stay principal investigator of some amount of research, but I'm more interested now in mentoring others who can do research that takes a launching pad from some of the things that my work has done, but takes it in a new direction, like figuring out effective interventions to see that the underserved individuals right in our own backyard get better care and have better outcomes.
You've worked with a lot of residents, with a lot of young faculty members, with graduate students in public health. As you look at the people that you've worked with over the years, who have you mentored, and who are some of them, and I'm sure you're proud of all of them, but as you look at the careers and some of the contributions they've made, who are some of the ones that stand out?
Sure. Well, one of my earliest mentees was Dr. Marilyn Shapiro, and she was here, and her husband, Dr. Raul Shapiro, was here. They were here for a long time. Marilyn has been very successful. They did leave our institution, sadly, and she is at the University of Pennsylvania now. But she is someone that I look on as, you know, a major contributor to the field. But there are others. Another early mentee of mine was Dr. Joan Neuner. And Dr. Neuner is now the co-program leader with me of the MCW Cancer Center's program in cancer control and outcomes, which is a critical program for our cancer center. Dr. Kathleen Fletcher has gone on to do really great work in the area of quality improvement and patient safety, and the interface between those areas and medical education. Dr. Sid Singh has become now the chief quality. He was one of my first hospitalist recruits when I was chief of GIM.
Sure.
Also worked with me in PCOR. We convinced him to get his master's in epidemiology, and then now he's gone on to do great work in the area of hospital medicine, totally outside of my work of cancer. And yet I was able to mentor him, and he has done some great work in hospital medicine and quality improvement, and now he's chief quality officer for Freighter and MCW. Another person that I think of very fondly in terms of proteges is Dr. Julie Mitchell. Dr. Julie Mitchell came with research training, but she was one of the people who realized she wanted to do more medical education scholarship. So she did great work in medical education, ran clerkships and things, but then decided she went back somewhat to her research roots, and as population health began to take off in the area of clinical administration, she became Freighter and MCP's Director of Population Health. And so she took the area that was kind of her research training and her medical education work, and has become an important leader for Freighter and MCW in terms of population health management. And I keep telling her we need to clone her because we need more people
Sure.
who can do what she can do in terms of running our clinical practices in a way that the research that the field of health services research, the research base that it has made, actually gets translated into how the systems to provide health care are set up.
Now-
And Sid does that as well in
Sure.
his chief quality officer area. So when I look at the people that I'm really proud of, they are a spectrum between people who spend 80% of their time doing research to people who spend half and half maybe research and medical education, to people who spend 80% of their time doing clinical administration, being clinical leaders, not just clinical care providers, but clinical leaders.
Now, you recently took on a new role as the Senior Associate Dean for Research. How did that go about? How did Dr. Kirshner, what's the process that led to Dr. Kirshner's appointment of you in this new position?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question because I am, I think, the first population scientist who has held this position. In the past, the individuals who have held this position, some of whom have been PhDs, and one at least was an MD PhD, Dr. David Gutterman, they have been much more oriented toward basic research, basic investigation. And I did not think of myself as a candidate for this position when it came open. I just didn't think of it as a pathway for myself. But I was meeting with Dean Kirshner on a infrequent but regular basis every, say once or twice a year, because of my role as director of the Center for Patient Care and Outcomes Research, which is an MCW center, so I reported to him in that regard. And during one of those meetings, he said to me, "Did you ever consider looking at the Senior Associate Dean for a Research position?" And the blunt answer was no. I had never considered it because I saw it as a basic science position. And he asked me to think about it. He said that he had not been, that between he and the search committee, they had not found the right candidates. They had been looking for a while already. They had not found the right candidates for MCW, and would I think about it? So I said, well, I'll think about it. And what I really did was go out and make appointments with each of the basic science chairs who would see me, and one of them was out of town, but the rest were really gracious and saw me within a week or two. And I knew these people, but very peripherally. And I went to them and I said, here's what Joe has asked me to think about. I don't want to think about it if I couldn't be successful in this role. Do you think a population scientist could be successful in this role? Would I be potentially acceptable to the basic science community? Because I didn't want to waste their time or my time going through a whole interviewing process if the answer was no. But they were unanimous in saying to me, it's different, but by that time I had a long history of funding, right? I've been funded for, 23 years, 24 years, something like that now. And so I had a long history of NIH funding. I had prominent papers and areas of science that I had advanced, and they were able to
Well,
see.
and you were also nationally respected.
Yeah.
You have been honored by the American College of Physicians. You've received a number of honors from them. You were selected by and I'm sure I'm going to get the name of the organization wrong, but the top section chief in general internal medicine by your peers at academic medical centers nationwide. And you're also a recipient of MCW's Distinguished Service Award, the highest award that they give. So
Yeah.
you've got a number of honors.
Well, and I'm grateful for those honors, but I still think that they might have said, look, it needs to be a basic scientist. You haven't done basic science research since you were a medical student. You don't belong in this job. But to their credit, they were incredibly open-minded. They could recognize that while their type of basic science, various other kinds of, biological or chemical systems, they could see the connection between that type of work and the type of more social science, behavioral health kinds of things that I had done, and that it could still be hypothesis-based, it could still be NIH fundable, it was still the area of advancing science, and the problems facing both types of research communities have enough commonality that they were willing to, at least interview me for that role. I wasn't asking them, would you support me to be that person? I was asking them, could you see me potentially in that role, someone with my background? And so I give them a lot of credit for being incredibly open-minded to think more broadly about the area of the sciences around healthcare, and that it wouldn't have to be an individual with that basic science background.
So now that you're in the position, what do you view as the goals that you've set for yourself and for MCW and research, and what are some of the challenges that you're facing?
Sure. So, well, one of the goals, one of the important strategic areas for the Senior Associate Dean for Research is to help the dean to gather data from a lot of places to help the dean decide where MCW should make our investments in research. We do have some ability to invest in research. We have Dean's Program Development Funds. We have, Advancing Healthier Wisconsin funding, some of which goes to the dean for advancing our research mission. So we have philanthropy.
CTSI.
CTSI. We have a number of areas. But we have to really look at ourselves and our strengths and look at the broad field and where is the field going? Where will be the fundable areas? And one person can't do that in isolation. You have to gather data from a lot of places. But I'm one of Dean Kirshner's advisors now in that general area of where should we put our money. what areas should we bet on and what kinds of people should we bet on. Largely, as it turns out, what kinds of people should we bet on to be department chairs? Because when you bet on a department chair, when you fund a department chair, you are funding their vision for where they will take their department clinically, if it's a clinical department, but in terms of research and education, if it's clinical or a basic science department. And so that's a really important decision. But it's like figuring out a chessboard, you know, where is the money? The money for bioinformatics, who should get that? You know, should it all be in the Human and Molecular Genetics Center? Maybe not. Maybe some of it should be in some other departments and other centers. And that is the kind of thing that we're thinking about now that is really complicated, but I find it really invigorating.
I've seen a lot of changes that have occurred at MCW since you came here in 1988. What's the same? Is there anything about MCW, is there something in the DNA or the personality of the institution that's the same today as it was in 1988?
So I think that we have an incredible gift in that we are very collegial. I think we were then, and I think we are now. When I hear some of the stories of cutthroat competition, one-upsmanship that happens at other places, and I do hear these stories. I go on site visits. I hear from colleagues, longstanding colleagues. I think we're really fortunate. We are collegial, and yet we do believe in being excellent. And so it's that combination of collegiality and working together, but having a goal of true excellence, whether it's in the clinical area, the educational area, the research area. We are striving for excellence, but we're doing it in a way that allows us to work together to do it. And I actually really believe that. I don't know if it's the fact that we have Midwestern roots that leads to that. Some of my colleagues on the coast attribute it to that, or if it's just part of the DNA of how we got started, and we had to be collegial when we were young and small and you know, starting with relatively fewer resources. But I'm very proud of our organization because I think collegiality and excellence are two of our hallmark characteristics, and I think they're things that have endured for the many years that I have been here already.
In recent years, you've seen MCW grow dramatically in terms of its geographic reach with the creation of new campuses, as well as with the academic programs, the creation of the Master of Science in Anesthesiology Assistant, the new School of Pharmacy that we have, the move to become a health sciences university. What do you see as the opportunities and some of the challenges that MCW may face in the coming years?
Yeah, well, I just see this as mostly opportunity, really. I think that extending our reach geographically and intellectually, extending, for example, to the College of Pharmacy, just gives us more and better opportunities for more collaboration. One thing I've learned in a field where collaboration is important is individuals with diverse backgrounds will think about a problem in a different way. They will contribute something special. It's part of the argument behind diversity in general, in that idea of putting together research teams or educational teams or clinical teams that have diversity. If you put them together right, what you get out of the diversity of backgrounds and ideas, are better pathways for where to go. Now, it can fall apart into Brownian motion, kind of going in too many different directions. It does require leadership to harness that diversity into a direction And admittedly, often these teams could go in one direction or the other direction, but they have to pick. They have to go somewhere. But that just, I see, I'm thrilled about the pharmacy school, for example, and the other campuses. But the pharmacy school is a good example where I think having multi-college teams will lead us to be even better with our research, with our teaching, and with our clinical care. It's just going to be win-win-win.
I appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
All right. Well, thank you for such insightful questions, Dick.
Thank you.